Welcome to Lesson 4 of Contemporary American Society, Causes and Consequences of Persecution in the United States. Today we're going to discuss ethnic persecution in the US and also how it differs from racial persecution, which we'll discuss next week. Ethnic persecution in the United States has existed since the early settlers arrived in America. But what exactly is ethnic persecution? How is it different from racial persecution? And how does it occur? In this lesson, we'll answer these questions and look at some examples of ethnic persecution. What are the major things that make you feel as though you belong to a certain group? Among other things, you probably speak the same language, celebrate the same traditions, and share a common history with others in the group. These elements make up the culture to which you belong. When that's considered, along with your nationality and race, it could indicate your ethnicity. Ethnicity is the culture a person belongs to. When that's considered along with your nationality, this could include also your religion and your customs. Ethnicity is generally difficult to describe. For example, in the United States, a Mexican American's ethnicity might be referred to as Hispanic or Latino, which generally describes their race or the language of their ancestors, not their ethnicity. In another country, that same person's ethnicity might be described as Mexican, referring to their culture and their heritage, their sense of family identity. While ethnicity refers to a person's culture, their background, their traditions, their history, their language, and their customs, how a person chooses to describe their ethnicity is known as self-identification. Ethnicity is different from race, which is biologically determined through the color of one's skin. What is ethnic persecution and what forms does it take? Ethnic persecution is the violation of human rights based on the ethnicity of a person or a group. Sadly, this has been a part of US history since the colonial period. In the mid-1800s, many Irish immigrated to the US to avoid starving to death in Ireland. They often faced persecution in America, where they were considered less worthy than other groups of citizens. Help wanted ads often included the abbreviation NINA. No Irish need apply. In other words, the company wouldn't hire Irish workers. The American discrimination against the Irish is an example of ethnic persecution. How can ethnic persecution happen? A common question that people ask is how ordinary human beings allow others to rise to power and engage in horrible acts of ethnic persecution. There are some things that often happen near the beginning of an ethnic persecution that allow the persecution to take root in a society. The very first stage of ethnic persecution is known as classification, and it involves creating an us and a them. Either at the same time or shortly after classification, people in power often create symbols to represent the different groups. This stage is known as symbolism. Classification and symbolism create an important step in ethnic persecution that's known as dehumanization. that is, making the targeted group seem less human. Often, cartoons and other propaganda are used. By the time a group has been widely dehumanized in the media, it can be too late to stop ethnic persecution. But if people don't stand up at that point, then it becomes more likely that ethnic persecution will occur. As political forces become more organized, more broken up into opposing groups, and bolder in their actions. Ethnic persecution can sometimes, although not always, lead to genocide or mass murder in order to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Genocide refers to acts to destroy a group through killing, causing serious physical and mental harm to bring about its complete destruction. It can also refer to forcibly preventing births and kidnapping the group's children. Ethnic cleansing is also a horrible crime. It refers to the forcible removal of an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group from a certain area, and it's considered a crime against humanity, which refers to certain acts purposely committed as part of a widespread or organized attack against civilians, people not in the military or on the police force. So ethnic cleansing is different from genocide. Since genocide involves the organized destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, whereas ethnic cleansing refers to trying to remove a group, usually an ethnic group, from a particular area. And it may include removing any evidence of that group's existence. For example, by destroying the group's property, like cemeteries and churches. An example of ethnic cleansing was in 1830 to 1850. Under the Indian Removal Act, the US government forcibly removed 60,000 Native Americans from the eastern United States to lands west of Mississippi, primarily to what is now Oklahoma. This was accompanied by a large number of deaths due to malnutrition and diseases. Let's watch a video about the ethnic persecution of Native Americans by the early European settlers. This was known as the Indian problem. You'll hear about the Trail of Tears, which was part of the removal of the approximately 60,000 Native Americans from where they lived. The European settlers who came to America beginning in 1492 were involved in massacres, the violent killing of a large number of people, and carried out genocides against Native Americans. The history of Thanksgiving, the national holiday that we celebrate in November, was first celebrated in 1620, when the settlers invited Native Americans to a large dinner. The settlers later killed the Native Americans, and then they thanked God for letting them do so. Approximately 12 million Native Americans died in what is now the United States between 1492 and 1900. Although the American Declaration of Independence guarantees life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not everyone in the colonies was considered equal. The colonies had a system of slavery, even though English Protestants thought of themselves as Puritans. Slavery refers to the state of being a slave, which is someone who works for a master and who decides their location and who holds the slave as their property forcefully. At least 35 million men, women, and children were brought to North America from Africa between the 16th and 19th centuries. About 12 million of those brought here were used to work in fields and under terrible conditions. Blacks had to fight in the US military a century before gaining civil rights and liberties. Civil rights are guarantees of equal opportunities and equal protection under the law, regardless of a person's race, religion, or other personal quality that identifies the person. More than 200,000 African Americans fought for the North in the American Civil War, and large numbers of free and slave Blacks were used for work in the South. After the Civil War, Blacks were freed. But between the 1860s and the 1920s, white Americans pushed out thousands of Blacks from the areas in which they lived. According to the one-drop rule, anyone with even a drop of Black blood was to be classified as being Black by the US Census Bureau, a government agency. This was an effort to bring back white supremacy after the Civil War, to recognize that whites are superior to all others. Let's see what happened in 1901 in Georgia. The men dressed in white robes and hoods are members of the Ku Klux Klan, an American white terrorist and hate group whose members believe that they're superior and should therefore control society. They primarily target African Americans, Jews, Latinos, Asian Americans, Catholics, Native Americans, Muslims, and immigrants. In 1912, in another part of Georgia, two supposed attacks on white women, attacks for which there was no proof, resulted in Black men being accused. In one case, a white mob took a Black man from jail, shot him, beat him to death, and hanged his body from a telephone pole. White people then threatened and intimidated the Blacks who lived there. The whites frightened them to the point that the Blacks sold their property at very low prices and ran off. The whites forced out every single Black, who were 10% of the population. In Oklahoma in 1921, mobs of whites attacked Blacks and burned their businesses and homes in the Tulsa Race Massacre. Some of the whites were allowed to make arrests and had been given guns by city officials. As a result, almost 300 Black people were killed, more than 800 were injured, and more than 10,000 were left homeless. Real estate and large amounts of personal property were damaged. Many whites and Blacks left the city, and those who stayed mostly kept quiet about the terror, the violence, and the losses for decades. The massacre was mostly left out of local, state, and national histories. In 1996, 75 years after the massacre, the Oklahoma State Legislature authorized a commission to study the Tulsa massacre. Its report in 2001 states that the city had joined with a mob of white citizens against Black citizens. Schools have been required to teach students about the massacre since 2002. Let's watch a short video about the forcible removal of Blacks from Forsyth County, Georgia in 1912. You'll hear about a lynching. A lynching is the killing of someone, especially by hanging, for a crime without proof or a legal trial. If you have any questions or comments, please email me. Next week, we're going to discuss racial persecution. Have a good week.